Welcome to our module on implementing peer network interventions for students with autism. I'm pleased to welcome you to the first of two modules aimed at supporting all students to access the rich range of social and learning opportunities that exist all throughout their schools. And to thank you for your commitment to creating school communities in which every student knows they belong. This presentation is a joint venture of the Human Development Institute and the Kentucky Autism Training Center, and I am so glad that you've joined us. If you're like most people, your memories of school are often marked more by the relationships you developed than by the curricula you covered. Schools are the social centers of kids' lives, and it's their interactions with friends and with classmates and with other peers who are attending their school that makes school something they look forward to. Working together on a group project, conversing over lunch in the cafeteria, hanging out between classes, enjoying an extracurricular activity, attending a school play or pep rally, and traveling to and from school. These multiple points of social connection provide so many opportunities for students to meet one another and to enjoy time together. And these social connections are not insignificant in their impact. We flourish most in relationships. And of course, research affirms what we all know to be so true, that relationships really matter in the lives of students. It's through their interactions with peers that students learn important social and communication, academic, self-determination, and other life skills. They encounter ideas and values, norms that shape their understanding of their world and themselves. The friendships they form provide a sense of companionship, emotional support, validation, and intimacy that enhances their well-being. And spending time together brings students a sense of satisfaction and personal enjoyment that makes going to school fun, or at least tolerable. And yet these relationships are not automatic for every student. And in fact, they can be far too rare for children and youth with autism. According to parents who were surveyed as part of the National Longitudinal Transition Study 2, 43% of youth with autism, ages 13 to 17, never saw friends outside of school. 84% never or rarely received phone calls from friends. And 50% had not been invited to any other youth social activities during the past year. Well, the portrait's not too different in elementary school. According to the Special Education Elementary Longitudinal Study, which presents a very similar portrait, 32% of children with autism were reported by their parents to have never visited with friends outside of school. 81% rarely or never received phone calls from friends, and 32% had not been invited to other children's social activities in the past year. Not once. Of course, national numbers are not nearly as important as what is taking place with your students in your school. How would you characterize the social lives of the students that you serve? Are their relationships rich and diverse, comprised of a balance of family members, friends, acquaintances, and professionals? Or are they more limited and narrow, comprised mostly of family members and paid staff with relatively few friends and acquaintances? What makes the difference between students whose social circles resemble the picture on the right versus those students whose circles more closely resemble the picture on the left? Well, you might be thinking that limited interactions and relationships are just intrinsic to having autism. After all, the definitions we so often see seem to usually emphasize the things our students cannot do or struggle to do. But I would emphasize that the biggest barriers to relationships in schools are not found in the characteristics of students with autism, but rather in the opportunities and the supports we provide in schools. In other words, even students who experience challenges in the areas you see on the screen can develop valued and satisfying relationships with their peers when provided the right opportunities and individualized supports. But we have to be intentional. Well, as a field, we now know quite a lot about how to create contexts in which peer interactions become the rule rather than the exception, where students have multiple and meaningful opportunities to meet one another, to spend time together, and to develop new friendships. So let me briefly offer a framework for thinking about the common types of barriers that need to be addressed when designing strong, social-focused interventions. 4 types of barriers often coalesce to limit social participation in schools. These barriers include the social and communication skill challenges of students with autism, and we'll call those student-related barriers. The knowledge and the attitudes and the intentions of peers, we'll call these peer-related barriers. There's the avenues through which adults support the participation of students with autism, called support-focused barriers. And the often limited opportunities that students with and without autism have to encounter one another during the school day, which we'll call opportunity barriers. And I placed each of these on the screen so you can see the ways in which they interact. Well, the best intervention approaches come at this work from multiple directions. They teach students the skills they need to build their social and communicative competence. For example, a teacher might introduce a social skills curriculum, or a speech-language pathologist might teach initiation or turn-taking skills. The best interventions also equip peers and invite peers so that they're comfortable and confident in their roles. For example, teachers might offer a training to peers that addresses effective ways to work with or assist their classmate with autism throughout the class period. They also rethink the ways in which support is provided to students so that it encourages rather than stifles interactions. For example, paraprofessionals might step back their direct support and instead encourage peers to step in and provide some of the assistance that students with autism needs, just as they would do for any of their other classmates. And they also create regular opportunities for students to encounter one another and spend enjoyable time together. For example, a teacher might arrange times for students to participate in a fun activity over lunch that capitalizes on the interests of the student with autism, but also involves several other students at the school. When all of these four areas are addressed well, both ongoing interactions and satisfying relationships, friendships perhaps, are likely to emerge. Well, peer networks are one powerful and practical way of bringing together these four areas of emphasis: to teach skills, to involve peers, to provide sufficient support, and to create ongoing opportunities. A peer network involves establishing a cohesive social group that meets formally and informally over time to enhance the social skills and peer relationships of an individual with a disability. An educator, a paraprofessional, or some other adult at the school organizes and facilitates the formal meetings of the group, but they remain largely behind the scenes in encouraging and supporting participants to connect with one another throughout the week. After explaining the purpose of the network to the student with autism and inviting his or her input on who should participate, the adult facilitator approaches potential peers. 3 to 6 peers, usually similar age schoolmates who have interests or experiences in common with a focus student, are invited to an initial orientation meeting. This orientation covers multiple topics, including the primary goals of the network, background about the focus student, the importance of confidentiality and respectful language, expectations specific to the peer network, and communication strategies relevant to the focus person, and guidance on when to seek assistance from the facilitator. And then during weekly or bi-weekly network meetings, the students all take part in mutually enjoyable activities, like an interactive game, a service project, a meal. And they plan times to connect with one another throughout the week, such as between classes, during breaks or lunch, after school or work. And they identify ways to involve the focus student more fully in other aspects of school and community. Over time, the involvement of the adult facilitator fades, and peers take the lead in organizing network meetings and activities. This intervention approach can be particularly valuable for students who you want to increase their opportunities to meet new peers at their school, provide practice and natural feedback on social communication skills, to become more involved together in school or after-school activities, to help them develop new friendships and have fun with other students. Likewise, they can also serve to help peers see students with autism in new ways, changing perspectives and expectations. And they can serve to raise awareness and acceptance at the school. Well, as with any good educational intervention, a team-based approach is critical when designing and delivering peer networks at your school. So let's talk through who in a school might be involved in this particular intervention. Well, each peer network is built around an individual student with autism, called the focus student in this module. Although the student can be of any age, networks have been most widely used with students from upper elementary through high school. They can be valuable for students across the entire autism spectrum, including those who do and do not have an intellectual disability and those who do and do not have complex communication needs or challenging behaviors. Well, the students without disabilities who comprise the peer network are called peer partners. Ideally, 3 to 6 peers from the same school would be invited to participate. The peers you select will make a huge difference, and we'll come back to this and how you might approach this selection. But for now, it's important to note that they come from the same school, they agree to their involvement, and they ideally would be students who have interests or experiences in common. Each peer network also has a staff person who takes responsibility for organizing and maintaining the group. Now, virtually any adult in a school could serve as a peer network facilitator. Although special educators and paraprofessionals may be the first to come to mind, don't overlook school counselors, general educators, coaches, club leaders, or related service providers. These individuals often have relationships with large numbers of students without disabilities, and they may have an easier time identifying peers to be part of a student's peer network who have interests in common with a focus student. If the special educator is not the facilitator, they still have an important role. They'll be part of any initial planning for the network. They might train the facilitator on how to implement the intervention. They may be part of the initial orientation meeting, and they may maintain regular communication with the facilitator and potentially families. 2 other partners are important to mention. Collaboration with families is essential if your goal is to foster social connections that extend beyond the school day and over time. Parents can provide the peer network with information about their child's strengths, interests, and out-of-school activities, all things that could provide the basis for connections and conversations with peers. And likewise, schools can keep parents informed about upcoming activities taking place outside of school so transportation can be arranged. And finally, related service providers can also play an important consultative or support role. For example, speech-language pathologists could emphasize instruction on social and communication skills that could be useful during peer network meetings, as well as enable students to use their AAC devices fluently across settings. A behavior analyst might help identify ways of diminishing challenging and stereotypical behaviors that hinder participation in inclusive activities or interactions with peers. And an occupational therapist might suggest technological or other adaptations that enable students to participate more fully in shared activities with peers. Well, with this overview in mind and a sense of the various partners in this intervention approach, let's turn to the steps you can take to launch peer networks in your school. I'll walk through each of these in order, elaborating on what each involves. Let's start with planning the peer network. Of course, it's always important to make sure you first have buy-in from your principal or other school leadership. In addition to endorsing your plans, they may have recommendations for staff who could serve as network facilitators or suggestions for settings within which peer network meetings could take place. Another important step is determining which students would benefit and how. Now, I always recommend asking students about their interest in having a peer network, as well as about their input into what form that network might take. So talking with students about their own goals and preferences related to having a network can be quite important. But you also want to consider how the peer network might be tailored to meet the social related goals of the student with autism. So consider a few questions. What social related goals does the student already have on his or her IEP? And which of these goals will you focus on as part of the network? For example, the student might have trouble initiating interactions with others. His interactions might not be very balanced or reciprocal. He might talk about conversational topics that are age inappropriate or repetitive. He might benefit from opportunities to use his communication device more. Or he might tend to interact more often with adults than with his peers. The answers to these questions might help you decide which peers to involve and what types of activities to build the network around. In addition, you'll want to consider the supports the student will likely need to participate in the peer network, such as a communication system or visual supports, a self-management system, or something else. Logistically, a few additional questions are likely to come up as you start your planning. For example, who will find out the student's interest in being part of a peer network? Who in the school will facilitate the peer network? When and where will the peer network meetings be held? Will it be aligned with a club, take place at lunch, be embedded into an advisory period, or even happen right before or after school? And how long will the peer network meet? A single semester or multiple semesters? In many cases, these are questions that are best answered in conversation with whoever will be serving as the facilitator of the network, which, of course, means it is important to identify that facilitator soon. You'll want someone who's committed to the goal of fostering friendships among students with and without autism, and who sees the importance of fostering reciprocal relationships rather than strictly helping relationships. You'll want someone who has a knack for seeing and making connections among students. And ideally, it is great to find a person who has some familiarity with the student with autism around whom the peer network is being established. However, this is not required, but it should certainly be someone comfortable with kids with and without autism. If you talk with someone and they are initially hesitant, you could offer to co-lead the peer network with them so they can see how it goes. If it's someone other than you who's facilitating the network, there are a few things to discuss with that person early on. And one is the purpose of the peer network. Now, you're likely to craft this purpose in a way that is much more specific to the particular student with autism. But here are a few broad goals of peer network interventions. To increase opportunities for students with autism to meet new people. To strengthen relevant social and communication skills. To help students develop new friendships. To encourage students to become involved together in school or after-school activities, and to connect with peers at their school with whom they can just have an enjoyable time. Likewise, you want to talk about the roles of the peer network facilitator. And these might include the following. Identifying students from the school to join the network, inviting these students to participate as peer partners, having an initial orientation meeting about the group, attending the network meetings and facilitating when needed to ensure everyone is included and participating in the activity or conversation, communicating with a special educator or IEP team about the group, and checking in regularly with peer network members to answer questions, to offer encouragement, and to evaluate impact. Facilitators will need to have the availability to meet with the peer network on a regular basis. Now, facilitating a peer network takes relatively little time once it's up and running, maybe 30 to 45 minutes per week. But there is an upfront investment in time to invite students and orient them to their roles. With your goals clear and your facilitator identified, you are ready to begin identifying peers. The success and the durability of the peer network will certainly be influenced by the peers who are invited to participate. And so it's important to think through which students at your school would be a good fit for this role. Now, put on the screen some questions to prompt your thinking about the qualities you might look for in potential participants. Which peers share interests, hobbies, or activities in common with the focus student with autism? Which peers have shown an interest in getting to know the student in the past? Which peers have consistent attendance? And who would model positive behaviors for the student? Who has good interpersonal skills and seems to get along well with others? Which peers are themselves kind of on the margins and who might benefit themselves from the connections that come from being part of such a network? Which peers are part of a larger friendship network? Involving a group of students who already know one another can help introduce the student into an existing friendship group. Which peers have common time available with the student during the day? And which peers can stay involved for the semester? Now, the selection process is certainly more art than science, but finding the right students will make all the difference as you move forward. And generally, you're aiming for between 3 and 6 peers. Once you have a sense of who you're looking for, your attention turns toward extending an invitation to be involved. I've placed on your screen 7 different approaches we have seen schools use when letting students know about the opportunity to be part of a peer network. Each has advantages and disadvantages, and so you'll want to think through each option. First, I'd recommend asking the focus student about the peers whom she or he would like to have involved. Friendship is always a choice, and so it's important to have this input. Of course, students may pick peers who would not be a good fit, who are not available, or perhaps may not even be interested. Well, a second approach might be to just spend time observing in the cafeteria, hallways, and classrooms to see who is already interacting with a student or seems drawn to him or her. You might discover peers who are already loosely connected to the student, but whom you never really thought about. On the other hand, you might discover the student's pretty isolated, which of course would further highlight the value of launching the network. In some schools, a school-wide invitation might work. This might involve making an announcement that generally describes peer networks at the school and then states that anyone who's interested in finding out more about this role can approach a particular teacher to share their interest. And one advantage of this is that it might draw out peers who you would never have thought of asking. A disadvantage, of course, is that it could inadvertently be done in ways that further stigmatize students. So do be careful how that invitation is extended. Now, the most common approach that we've seen has been teacher recommendations. For example, ask coaches, club leaders, and others who they think would fit well with a student's network. Sometimes special educators are not so well connected to students without disabilities. So ask the teachers who are connected to do the inviting for or with you. Now, this approach allows teachers to pick students based on certain qualities that would be likely to make them a good match for the focus student. The caution is that we find teachers tend to turn primarily to high-achieving students and to girls. Now, of course, both categories make great peer partners, but lots of other students could benefit from involvement as well. And with the high ratio of students with autism who are boys, friendships may be more likely to form with peers who are also boys and vice versa. 3 more approaches I'll mention only briefly. If there are existing friendship groups, cliques or social groups that you think would be a good fit given the focus student's interests and experiences, you could approach this group to get all of them involved together. Likewise, you could approach peers who are all involved in the same club or extracurricular activity, particularly when it is one in which the focus student would like to be involved. Finally, some schools already have peer buddy or peer tutoring programs. This comprises a pool of students who already have an interest in getting to know the students with disabilities and who are interested in making the school a more inclusive community. In most cases, a conversation with a potential peer partner makes it pretty clear whether they're interested or not, and if so, why they're interested. But if you aren't quite sure, there are some questions you might pose that will help you explore their interests and motivation, as well as help you identify early on some of the supports peers might need to be comfortable and confident in their roles. How well do you already know the focus student? What interests you most in being part of a network? Have you done something similar in the past? What expectations do you have? Are there aspects of the experience you are especially excited about or worried about? What other school and community activities are you involved in? What experiences have you had that you feel would make you a good peer network member? What questions do you have about this role? And what do you hope to gain from this experience? This is not an interview script, just examples of potential questions. Well, with your focus student and peer partners identified, it is time to launch the network. Now, the first meeting provides a chance to orient students with and without disabilities to the goals and activities of the peer network. Specifically, the goals of this first gathering are to clarify the purpose of the network, to facilitate introductions among participating students, to discuss activity ideas for future meetings, to share suggestions for other peers at the school whose involvement might be encouraged, to think about ways to connect with one another outside of the meeting, to establish a regular meeting time and location, and of course, to answer questions students have. When students do not already know one another, some sort of icebreaker or other introductory activity can be incorporated to get students learning about each other's interests, strengths, and preferred communication approaches. The rest of the items I've placed on your screen, they just represent one potential agenda for this first orientation. Well, as with other individualized interventions, the topics addressed in this initial orientation should always be matched to the nature of the interactions you're trying to promote, to the activities students will do together, and to the students who are participating. So before the meeting, think about the question about the students who will be involved, and then ask yourself these questions. What might students with and without disabilities need to know to feel comfortable and confident in their interactions and activities together? What would they need to know about one another, about the activities they will do, about the group and how it'll function, and about the adults who are involved? The answers might help you determine what other information should be covered in this first meeting or in subsequent meetings. To summarize, the first meeting is a time to orient students to the goals and activities of the peer network and to do the needed planning for future meetings. On your screen is a checklist the facilitator can use to structure this meeting and to guide their own reflection. You could readily turn this into a printed document, adapting these items as you see fit. And I've included an example of that on your screen. Let me pause here to say a few things about the involvement of the student with autism. Some students who can communicate on their own and are interested in doing so, they may want to share what they find makes interactions with peers harder or easier for them as part of this first meeting. For students who have more complex communication challenges, you should consider how you will share with the group the best ways to interact with the student, perhaps by modeling this with the student's permission. Well, most peer networks begin meeting weekly following the first orientation meeting. The main goal of these weekly meetings is for students to develop and deepen their relationships with one another through ongoing conversations and enjoyable shared activities. The meeting also provides a context for students to plan more informal social connections throughout the rest of the week and explore ways of connecting the focused student more fully in the life of the school. Most peer network meetings embed several different activities. The arrival and time of informal conversations, participation in a shared and mutually enjoyable activity, some discussion of their social contacts outside of the meeting during the prior week, and any feedback or ideas from the adult facilitator, all in around 30 to 45 minutes. For example, a peer network meeting at lunch might involve a small window of time when students are getting their meals and arriving to the meeting location, like a particular lunch table or an empty classroom or even out in the courtyard. And then a time when students play a board game or a favorite app, or talk about an upcoming school event or plan a future after-school activity. And then a short wrap-up discussion when students compare their schedules to find sometimes they'll connect with one another socially, maybe in the hallway during a passing period or at a break, maybe over lunch or before school or as part of a club meeting or during a class they happen to take together. The checklist on your screen can be used by the facilitator as a way to reflect on how well these different aspects of the meeting went. A couple of additional points. Some students with autism may need help with planning these additional social contacts, or maybe support from an adult to get where they need to be. This is where communication between the facilitator and the special educator will be most important. It can also be helpful to ask for copies of each peer partner's course schedule and a list of any extracurricular activities in which they're involved. This will help you identify potential places and times of connection throughout the week. I'd like to make a few more comments here about the choice of activities. Now, this is one place where the input and guidance of the facilitator can be especially helpful, particularly when a student has interests that do not typically match their age or has very restricted interests that don't align with the interests of others in the group. When you think about which activities the students might do together, pick activities that are age appropriate. For example, if students is really into coloring, the group might instead paint posters for the upcoming football game. Now, when the focus student has some sort of perseverative interest, see if there's a way to identify fun games or activities that touch on that interest, if that's appropriate. Pick activities that are interactive and have an active and valued role for everyone. And plan for how the student with autism will be involved if they have significant communication difficulties or mobility challenges. And finally, focus on activities that can be easily done in the available time and location. Well, as the students gain more confidence and experience as a peer network, you'll want to document the extent to which the focus student is making progress on those skills you identified at the outside of your planning. You might track goal progress related to initiating conversation, appropriate responding and turn taking, maintaining engagement in a social activity, or seeking out their peers outside of meeting times. When students with autism who also have complex communication challenges are part of a network, you'll want to pay particular attention to the messages that are included on the student's communication device, as well as how peers are introduced to these communication modes. So some guiding questions to consider. Do peers understand the ways in which messages are communicated when this AAC system is used? Does the form of AAC used by the student provide sufficient flexibility to be useful within a range of interaction contexts and settings? Does the device include topics that peers would actually want to talk about? Does the student have consistent access to his or her device throughout the school day? And is the student supported to use the device to communicate with peers beyond the school day? Well, it may take as much as 6 weeks or more before a peer group really gels and the facilitator can begin fading back their active leadership of those weekly peer network meetings. As networks do strengthen, attention should turn to how best to maintain the network over time. This becomes particularly important in middle and high school when students' schedules change pretty dramatically from one semester to the next, and they may no longer have the same free times in common. Well, as the peer network continues over time, you'll want to invest the time to understand its impact and how to improve the intervention. The relationships of children and youth are notorious for the unexpected twists and turns they take. And so it's important to regularly reflect on the process and outcomes associated with peer network interventions. Now, assessing the social dimensions of the lives of students is tough work. The outcomes that matter most are usually the hardest to measure. The published literature highlights a constellation of measures that could provide useful insights into the social lives of students with autism. Initiations, responses, reciprocity, affect, interaction quality, social contacts, social status, friendships, and many others. I've placed just a few examples on your screen. My point in doing so is to emphasize the importance of not assuming these networks are having an impact, but rather assessing whether and how they're having an impact. Thoughtful data collection using relevant and rigorous measures is essential to ensuring students with autism are making progress in an area so vital to their well-being and success in school. Observations provide probably the most direct and objective approach for capturing the impact of peer networks. For example, you might observe students before and during and outside of the network meetings to gauge whether and how peer interactions are changing and the nature of the relationship students are forming. But I'd also recommend that you combine with your direct observations conversations with different stakeholders who are involved in and impacted by the peer network. The student with autism, of course, is the primary focus of the intervention. So what do they think about being part of a peer network? What do they enjoy most? What was most difficult? What ideas or input do they have for moving forward? What are they learning about themselves and about others through this involvement? I placed on the screen some example questions you might ask, and some students may have difficulty sharing their answers verbally. So consider alternative ways you might have them share their thoughts about their involvement. For example, you might simply simplify the questions. You might provide multiple options with accompanying pictures, or incorporate response options into their communication device. Likewise, you'll want to know what participating peers think. And so you might ask them about their experiences in the network, the successes and challenges they've encountered, how they would characterize the new relationships they're forming. What words do they use to talk about relationships? What are the ideas they have for supporting greater inclusion at their school and the supports they feel would help them serve more effectively in this role? Again, this slide includes examples of questions you can use, adapt, or add to. And if you're not the facilitator, you will definitely want to be in regular communication throughout the semester. I've placed on your screen some example check-in questions that you could draw upon as you solicit their feedback and input. You definitely want to make sure the facilitator feels well supported. Questions like, what is your overall impression of the peer network? How would you describe the experiences of students who were involved? How effective have peer partners been in their roles? What strategies do these peers still need to learn, and what concerns, if any, do you still have? What sort of assistance or support would be most helpful for you from me in your role as a facilitator? And what have been the benefits to students with autism, to their peer partners, to you, to the school? And finally, communication with parents and other family members can provide you with an important vantage point on the extent to which new relationships are extending beyond the school day, as well as how the student with autism is being impacted by their involvement. This is particularly important when working with students who have very limited verbal communication. Likewise, parents can be instrumental in providing the transportation or other supports needed for peer network members to connect with one another outside of school or on the weekends. So consider carefully how you will maintain this communication and what you can and what should be shared. If done well, participating students will be positively impacted by their involvement in a peer network. But as you involve more students with disabilities and their peers in these interventions, you might also start to see some broader changes taking place in your school. For example, your students might begin spending more time in inclusive classrooms. The new friendships they form may help them get connected to clubs, student organizations, or other extracurricular activities. Other educators at your school may find themselves more connected to students with autism through their involvement in facilitating a peer network. With some success, perhaps more resources will become available at your school to further support the development of positive peer relationships. And maybe the culture of your school will become more welcoming as it becomes more inclusive. Is it becoming a place marked by belonging? Well, as we come towards the end of the module, you're probably wondering whether peer network interventions really do work. Do they really have an impact on the social lives of students with autism? Is this among the best of what we know works for improving outcomes socially for our students? Is there good reason to anticipate the benefits we've been talking about are likely to be evident in your school and for your students? Well, the short answer is yes. Peer network interventions have been evaluated fairly extensively for students with autism, including those with complex communication needs. Now, depending on how you define a peer network, more than 10 studies have evaluated these interventions, and they've been implemented across a wide range of school settings, including cafeterias, advisory periods, and extracurricular activities. There is certainly sufficient evidence to describe peer networks as an evidence-based practice for promoting social outcomes for students with autism. Well, while it is always essential that you evaluate the impact of the supports you are providing to your particular students, research suggests this is a very, very promising practice. I've placed on your screen just a sampling of what these studies have found in terms of the benefits to students and their peers, as well as the extent to which these studies and the approach are considered to be acceptable and feasible. For example, Jenny Asmus and her colleagues established peer networks for 47 high school students with severe disabilities, more than half of whom also had autism. These peer networks averaged 5 students, and they met an average of 7 times throughout a single semester. Adolescents with severe disabilities experienced significant increases in the number of extended social contacts they had and the number of new friendships they developed. Likewise, Julie Hockman and her colleagues established peer networks that met formally during school lunch periods for 4 students with autism and their identified peers. All of the students with autism experienced substantial increases in peer interactions and social engagement over the course of one semester of implementation. Well, I've placed on your screen a sampling of other studies that have evaluated variations of this peer network approach. For those of you interested in reading more about these interventions and their outcomes, I would encourage you curl up with one or more of these studies to learn about the implementation and impact of these interventions. Well, let me close by offering just a few final thoughts on getting started. First, start with just 1 or 2 peer networks, and then add more each semester. Invest more heavily in getting some initial experience, and then expand gradually. Second, with some success under your belt, ask the individuals who have served as facilitators to share their experience at faculty meetings. This could help you with building awareness among school staff, as well as lead to some new volunteers to serve as facilitators. Third, document the activities students do together through photos and videos so you can show others what peer-mediated supports look like. Fourth, peers are going to become the best recruiters of other students, so work with them to craft a strong recruitment plan at your school should you opt to roll out more peer networks for more students. And finally, evaluate your efforts so you can tell a strong story about the impact of these interventions at your school. Social relationships are of central importance in the lives of children and youth with autism, just as they are for any other student in your school. As educators and advocates, you can play a powerful role in providing students the instruction, supports, and opportunities they need to develop positive and satisfying relationships with their peers. The considerations and approaches described in this module hold great promise for enhancing the social lives of students with autism in inclusive schools. But this work is also important for another reason. It ensures other students in the school have the opportunity to meet and to benefit from and to enjoy the friendships they form with such important members of their school and community. And so I wish you well as you pursue peer networks in your school.